Hello and good afternoon. Welcome. I'm really excited. This is the fourth conversation today here on Conversation Day TT, and it's hosted by Trini Good Media in collaboration with the Bocas Lit Fest. I've got some amazing people here, so I'm going to get right into the introductions, and I'm going to start off with Mark. Mark is a writer and photographer, and he's also the editor of technewstt.com, very well known in all the photography circles and journalist circles in TNT. So welcome, Mark.
Thank you.
And also my dear friend and amazing poet, Zahra Gordon. Zahra is a poet, writer, educator and communications professional who blogs at Z Speaks, not to be confused with ZTV.
Yeah.
Welcome, Zahra.
Thank you.
And Zahra, I'm going to get back into who you've chosen today. Very interesting choices. And I'm very pleased to welcome Lasana Liburd. And Lasana is a veteran journalist. He looks so young. He looks like he just jumped into journalism. And he's the managing director of Wired868.com. I'm sure he's very familiar to all of you. So today we're asking the question, what would one of our heroes do in a trying time? And it's both light and it's heavy. And in the sense that it's an extremely personal choice for all of us, and at the same time we're all in a position where we all have a social responsibility, not just with the Black Lives Movement, but also with COVID-19. We all have to take part in a public conversation while doing our private part. So I'm going to kick off with Mark. Mark, these are extremely troubled times. Black Lives Matter, protests on top of a pandemic. Who is your hero, and what would he say as a broad brush thing about these times?
When I got asked this, I had to think for only like 30 seconds about who would be the person that I think about. It would be my grandfather. My grandfather took the place of my father as a male compass in my life. My father left the home when I was 7 years old. And he did a remarkable thing in my estimation. He let me grow while guiding. And I think if he were in this space today, all the things that he did in his life 40, 50 years ago would still remain so chillingly relevant. My grandfather was a full-blooded Indian man. My grandmother was a red woman. I have the pictures here.
Fiery,
you always walk with visual aids.
Very fiery.
Visual aids.
Very good-looking man.
Visual aids. My grandfather and my grandmother.
Okay, so that explains your looks.
So, I mean, the remarkable thing about them is that I grew up hearing that my grandfather had problems in the teaching. They were both teachers. They had problems in the teaching service. When I came to know them as a child, they were running a private school in Belmont. And of course, I didn't understand what problems in the teaching service meant then. But now, of course, it's obvious that having stepped outside of his race, he would have encountered what we now call systemic racism. There would have been people who would have taken an attitude towards him because of his choices in life and so on. I think the remarkable thing about him is that he chose to never let the things that had happened to him color his approach to his own life and his own interactions with people. And I know this for a fact because of two things. One, and both of them are related to his teaching service. When he taught at Aruka, there was a young student there who was extremely poor. His name was Percival Agard. He went on to be known as Teacher Percy. And Teacher Percy had the experience of coming to school with shoes that were completely inadequate, and my grandfather took him to get a pair of shoes, just because you can't go to school like this. I only discovered this many years later when I voiced a vague interest in cricket, very ill-advised. And Teacher Percy insisted, that we have to go to sports and games and get a full cricket kit. Of course, it was a terrible waste of money because I was a horrible cricketer and generally a terrible sportsman.
You made up for it, Mark.
Well, and the other thing was his lifelong doctor, who used to be the head of Astra, he was a Muslim man, was dedicated to him until the day he died. He came to our home to officially pronounce him dead. And one day he told me why. This is the doctor's mother and father were extremely concerned about sending their children to a school. They were girl children. The boys were fine, but the girl children. And my grandfather and grandmother sat with them and said, listen, send them to our school, they'll be safe. And because of that, the girl children in that Muslim household got an education. And that Muslim man never forgot that.
That's amazing.
And these are the two things I know about. So I always think
and both those lessons can be surely carried over to what's happening with us here today in a variety of ways, which is keeping open through pain and not allowing a history of pain to overcome whatever you can be as a human being. And I want to come right back to that. But for the moment, I want to skip across to Zahra. Zahra, you've chosen your great-grandmother, Rhoda Fonsett, as your hero. And that is really, really interesting to me because I think all of us feel that the only way that we can find ourselves is by going back to where we came from, where our essential selves. Tell me about your grandmother. Why was she so special, your great-grandmother?
Well, I think for a lot of the reasons that Mark would have mentioned about choosing his grandparents is that we find out about our families through these family histories. And I like to think of this idea of the always coming back to the personal being political.
Yes.
So there are things that you do in your everyday life that would actually be seen as a political act or contribute to the overall consciousness. And just for me, hearing of my great-grandmother through these stories that live on. She was bold, she was proud of who she was as a black woman in the early 1900s. You know, she was an orphan, and and a time period like that to have been a black woman, also an immigrant from Barbados in Trinidad who was orphaned, it was, I imagine, very difficult. And somehow the stories that we know of her are only good ones, and only, you know, this very bold-faced woman, really.
Yes.
You know, I have a poem that I wrote about her. So she had 8 children, and she was the type of 8. Okay. And she, on a Sunday morning, she would show up to church, you know, an hour after church started with her 8 children, and she will go to the front pew. Right, you know, it was reserved for her, basically, right? And she didn't care if she was late or what, that's her pew, and that's where she's coming, and she's coming in late with everybody towing behind, and she just was that type of person. And I think her contribution today would have just been living her life unapologetically. And I don't think, you know, she would have been necessarily like out protesting, whatever, but I do think that she would have been very aware of her voice and very aware of just how her survival was part of, you know, her survival and her pride was part of the personal being political.
And I think today, you know, a lot of women are speaking about agency, right? It's like, oh, we didn't realize that we didn't have agency. We didn't realize that we could do this. We've always felt that we ought to live by certain rules that, you know, prescribed to us when we were born. But it appears that your great-grandmother had a very innate agency and a sense of very much taking her place in the world, in that she brought all the 8 children, she brought them, she knew what she wanted them to do, which was sit in church and listen to that service. And it's very interesting you said that she was from Barbados, because last night I was having a conversation, and when we speak to Lasana, I want to go across to that. You know, a lot of the apartheid movement was fed in Barbados. I mean, it was one of the most racist colonies at the time. So she would have still been feeling the colonial hangover, and yet she had a very innate sense of who she was. And when we come back to you, Zahra, I really want you to come with one or two stories that are emblematic for you of who she is.
Yeah.
But I'm going to ask Lasana Liburd now. Lasana, you're a sports person, and of course, we would have thought that you'd go with a sports personality. You went with Nelson Mandela, and particularly the young Nelson Mandela. What about his life torched your imagination?
Well, first, it's Liburd, by the way.
Sorry.
Pronunciation. And interestingly, as everyone spoke about family and so on, right? Well, Liburd is a petition name because my father is from St. Kitts. He met my mom here in university, right? And I remember for every July, August holidays, I would go to my uncle in Tobago, Fenwick Moran. He eventually changed his name to Mbao Mohini. I'm a member of NJAC.
Oh,
Okay.
And he had all of these books and tapes and so on. So he would have Frantz Fanon, Ivan van Sertima lectures, Malcolm X speech, Martin Luther King, and so on. So this was like a sort of secondary education because you're bored and there's no internet or anything else at the time. So I'd read these books. And I suppose a chance to cross in the end Nelson Mandela, right? Early on, of course, I loved the brand Malcolm X.
Yes.
Sort of say that, I love the cool photograph of him standing with the gun and everything else. That caught my imagination.
Cool.
Where I felt Mandela was a combination of the different people is that Mandela started off with a defiance campaign in South Africa. He started off as a peaceful protester as well. By the end, though, he was a terrorist according to the South African government and a lot of the world, and he was waging violent warfare. Well, at least they were destroying state property.
Yes.
They were doing, a series of sabotage, against government property and plans all over the country. And I felt that Mandela, what I appreciated, what grabbed me was that he was a very pragmatic, analytical person.
Yes.
So if he felt that one thing, the early peaceful protests wasn't getting the results that they wanted, he had no problem going to phase 2 and phase 3 and whatever it took to get the job done.
So he was obviously, you were very moved by the idea of justice. You got a sense of justice very early on when you were a kid.
I did, and that's how I think I ended up in journalism. I think journalism is a place for people who have that strong desire. Otherwise, it really isn't worth it as a job.
To be a watchdog, right? To be a watchdog of the powerful, to make sure that they continue to be a voice of the people.
Yeah.
And so now I want to come back, but I do want to ask you this question. There are people who are saying about the Black Lives Matter movement. So now I'm going to ask you, what would Nelson Mandela have done in terms of the Black Lives movement, how it's literally spread like wildfire, just not across America, but across continents, cities. It's literally everywhere. It's on everybody's tongue. Everybody's speaking about it. What do you think Nelson Mandela would have said now?
It's ironic that people spend so much time criticizing the quote-unquote rioters. Like I said, for sure, Mandela was never afraid to do whatever it took.
Yes.
There's always an end game to it, though. He wouldn't just be breaking a store window without a plan. At one time, his plan was to make South Africa almost ungovernable, to make what they saw as the oppressors unable to carry on life as usual. That was the goal. And with the Black Lives Matter movement, of course, there's no one head in terms of leadership, and definitely a lot of stuff is getting done right now. We do see changes and so on. For sure, though, Mandela would have had a systematic plan in terms of what he wanted to achieve and everything that they did, and that leadership. We know that we want equality, as you say, we want Black lives, but how do we get it? And how do we gauge, how do we know when we have it?
Yes.
Right? You're talking about education, economic equality before the law and everything else. And I think leadership would be about let's say, setting a timeline, clearly identifying what the goals are beyond the slogan. And I think that for sure that would be where Mandela would come in, as where his strength would show.
And he seemed to know exactly the touch to put at which situation, right? When to calm people down and when to say, okay, now it's time to fight.
But he was light on his feet, so he adjusted.
Yes.
So he would know when he needed to do something.
And
different.
I love that point of yours, which was that we know that there's no change without revolution, but there has to be, maybe it's time for a plan. Now that the revolution has begun against, you have to say it was 400 years of slavery, followed by very systemic racism over years, and 20 years of civil rights movement. The Equal but Separate Act, I think, was passed. That legislation was only passed in 1964. So that was very systemic, deep-rooted racism, which is now coming to the fore, and it would need young people like you and. I mean, I don't know why I keep saying you're so young.
Take it.
But basically, I love the idea that you have brought up now. It's like, guys, okay, we've got the world's interest now. They know what they've done, whether it's reparations, whether it's changing systems, whether it's creating museums. I mean, that is the way I think that we have to now start. Well, I guess now I'm removing myself for this because I particularly feel this is a revolution for Black Lives Mattering. Everybody else who has been silent on it, they can support, but it really has to be a revolution that comes from within. Would you agree?
I do agree that in terms of starting a revolution, but this is where the sport bit comes in, right?
Tell me.
In sport, there's a scoreboard, and after 90 minutes, you know who won based on that scoreboard. So you have to know what victory looks like. Now, often you go along with something, and at the end of the day, you kind of feel good about yourself, so you thought it was a good day. You know, in sport, we don't think like that. You go based on data. So in that sense, when you have this movement, you have to decide what is a win in the end, and that's where you're going for. If you don't have that, then you do not have a win, you have a loss. And I think that would be Mandela, to me, was a very pragmatic person.
So you're going for the long game, which is brilliant.
You're setting targets for yourself, and unless you hit those targets, you haven't won yet, essentially.
Thank you, Lasana. We'll come back to you. Mark, I want to come back to the question of your grandfather. Now, I think Dr. Eric Williams recognized very early when he wrote his seminal book, Slavery and Colonialism, that actually the way to level any rough playing field was education. And your grandfather was clearly an educator.
Yes.
And you are a product of him, a quintessential Trinidadian, a complete mix, which is what we are as a people. What role do you think your grandfather would have said education played in the Black Lives Matter movement today?
The thing about him is that I don't think you would have found him in the street marching, though I know that when they decided to take his land down Chaguaramas, he was in that march. So he would march if he needed to, but his responses were always based on what can I do here in this space with the people that I can reach. So that a really quite amazing number of people came out of my grandfather's preschool. People like Theron Shaw, people I didn't know went to my grandfather's preschool. Said, yes, I went to your grandfather's preschool, you don't remember? I was like, no. And he drilled down into, these are people I can reach, this is a change I can make, these are things that I can make happen. I think his mission was always to educate. So you had A for apple, B for bat going down the road. But there was a strong sense of equal treatment, equal rights. I wish I'd had it, because as his grandson, you learn that you're staying after class. And no sweetie for you at all.
That means he really loved you a lot, huh?
Well, there's love, and then there's what you feel like at the time. I think some of it resonates with what Zahra was talking about. Her grandmother had 8 children, which means that she influenced 8 people. And exponentially, those 8 people would have taken those learnings and taken them on further. I don't think we can ever discount the power of the seed of a good, strong idea, well articulated, either through action, through statement, or through demonstration, affecting someone and that going on to affect others. So I think in every instance of someone that I've met who's been touched by my grandparents, and even my uncle, who was an educator in hospitality in the Bahamas. People just crop up, somebody mentioned something and I was like, wait, you were in the Bahamas? Did you study? Oh yes, he was a great teacher.
So you're saying the stone of education makes a huge splash.
It ripples and ripples.
And so that is really what your father, he really lived by that. And of course the early life, your grandfather, sorry, your early life education, that's what people say was really vital. I want to ask Zahra, just jumping on, what would your great grandmother, what would Rhoda have done if somebody came to her and said, here what, you can't sit in the front row, that is reserved for another race, or that is reserved for somebody else. How would she have reacted?
There might not have been a church.
She would have burned it down.
Yeah, that would have been just like that precinct that got burnt up in Minneapolis. It might be the same. I'm saying that kind of jokingly, but I do think that she's the person who would have taken a stand against things like that. Because she was very pushy in this sense, right? And to think of the time period, and to think of somebody who is coming from a marginalized community being very pushy and very outspoken, it's kind of like, well, how did you navigate this space then? And in this timing, if you had actually been in after the movement of female agency and feminism and womanism, to think she might have been a leader actually because of that nature that would have been repressed at another time. And it's very interesting because for me, Lasana talked about the Black Lives Matter movement not having actual leaders, but the founders or the people who created that hashtag, who actually did have policies that they wanted to impart, were two black women whose names have now become erased because it's been overshadowed by the hashtag or by other actions of people actually taking over their movement. So that's one of the things where, I like to say her name and bring her up and sort of rewrite her into history. So and funny, just an anecdote, I put down her name in the email as Rhoda Fonset because she married my great-grandfather who was a Fonset. But in our house, and just generally, she was known by her maiden name of Reed. So this is also something that I am always wondering, well, how did you navigate this space? You're a married woman in the 20s, and people still refer to you as Rhoda Agatha Reed, not Fonset, when, marriage was that big identity at the time. So there's a lot of things that she's done and just the way that she carried herself that really make me feel like she would have been a leader within this time.
And what has she sparked in you in terms of personally in terms of this movement? How do you feel in terms of how you can take this movement forward in your personal life and how you can support it at the wider level? Well,
for me, she sparked pride, definitely, in my ancestry and in my heritage. And it is, for me, Black Lives Matter, when we talk about it, is not something that I'm coming to now. It's a way that I've been living my life. In the same way that Lasana would have come at a very young age, being introduced to people like Malcolm X. I was also introduced to people like that at a young age, like around 8. So it's always been a way that I have lived as being proud and as just making sure that my voice remains to be heard.
Sounds like she was too big for her married name.
Well, I've never carried my married name, so my earlier on, I think I had some protestations, but oddly it was my father who said to me, "You've been a Mathur all your life. Who are you?"
And it's actually not. It's not necessary, really, because it's not like it's on the books. It's just a tradition that we've somehow very much held on to. Right. So a lot of people would like for what reason?
And you know, women are in charge in any way, so why say, you know, why even pretend otherwise? Lasana, I want to ask you, your hero, Nelson Mandela, of course also the hero of the world, what would he have thought of us, our islands? Right now in Trinidad and Tobago, yes, we've had self-rule, I think, for 58 years. Yet every year we have up to 500 murders. Many of those murders come from you know, marginalized communities, low-income communities, and many of the people, young people we lose every year are young black men to drugs, to guns, to being manipulated by much higher powers with much greater funds and agendas than they could ever imagine. What do you think he would say to our people and how we should rise up?
Well, it's interesting, of course, because the old Mandela, you know, accepted a power sharing agreement, essentially, which is what he did with South Africa, whereas now we moved into a black government. So they were running the country in that sense, but the old structure, the land, the resources, the power, and so on, of course, remained as it had before with white South Africa. And there's a lot of people felt that justice wasn't served, essentially, in South Africa, right? We look at it as a model of love, right? And him being able to turn the other cheek, essentially. But as Peter Tosh sang, you know, without justice, it's hard to ever find peace, right? People have to feel like they have a fair shake in what's happening, right? And South Africa is right now, of course, a very violent place, so he might have been a little bit distracted with that right now. But in terms of Trinidad, I feel, and I made a joke recently in one of my pieces, you know, maybe we need a Truth and Reconciliation Commission ourselves here, yes, because we do not seem to get each other very, very well. Yes. You know, the interaction we have in Trinidad, a lot of it is extremely superficial. Everybody
in these islands feels beleaguered. Everybody feels that they are the community that has been downtrodden.
Well, that's also true. I spoke to someone recently, you know, who had done the All Lives Matter thing, and he was pointing out how the Syrian community and the Caucasian feel that they've been picked on a lot.
Oh well, no, we don't want to go there, but
yeah. So, but like I said, these are the narratives that people hold of each other, and I think that to move beyond the violence and that kind of thing, first people need to feel like they are a part of society. Society allows them to share in the spoils, let's say, yes. And I think that also we need a re-education so that we understand where we're from and we feel some sense of self-worth as well. And until you have that, and when people do not think much of themselves or much of the person next to them in their community, then you're always going to have violence to me. So I think that re-education is important there.
And what I'm hearing from you in the earlier part of your answer is that we need institutional change as well, because we inherited a lot of the institutions from the colonies. So perhaps that's what we need in order for real change to happen.
Well, of course. I mean, we were behind for so many centuries almost, you know, yes. And it's not good enough to say, okay, you know, black Trinidad needs to catch up. That's not how it works. There's the settler population that gave the Portuguese and so on land for the moment they came here. We've seen, let's say, the carve up very recently of Shagaramas that went to a lot of non-black, let's say, business owners, for instance. So it isn't enough to say, you know, you guys need to work hard and catch up. That's not how you got to the top, you know. And if you want to make things really equal now, then, you know, we really need to focus on giving blacks a share, you know, a fair share of the spoils, you know, in terms of our progress, essentially, I think. And we're not, by the way, looking to take away from what anybody else has. Yes. Just a matter of giving us the opportunity to be there. So when you point to a black guy who has done well from a poor upbringing, right? Because he worked 3 times as hard as someone of a different race. That's not good enough.
No.
You know, it's supposed to be equal, that everyone has to do the same effort to get to this. And once a guy has to work 3 times as hard as someone else, that's not a fair system.
No, you're asking for the level playing field. And it appears to me that you actually have the last word because we're out of time. I have to thank you all so much for this conversation. It's been amazing speaking to all of you. Mark, thank you so much. As always, Zahra, it's such a pleasure, and Lasana, thank you so much for your insights. This has been Conversation Day TT with our Bocas Lit Fest. I'm Ira Mathur. Thank you so much for being with us.